In this video, we're going to cover Carl Jung's ideas on marriage as a psychological relationship. I'd remind you here that Jung is focusing on the psychological aspect of marriage through the dichotomy of the conscious and unconscious, and as a result is not focusing on the external aspects of marriage, although they are obviously important as well. Beginning with the concept of the unconscious, we can see that there is no psychological relationship without consciousness. For if people are unconscious, psychologically they can't be aware of one another in order to form a conscious psychological relationship. Sure, they can have a relationship of some other kind, but the relationship is not a psychological one. So I hope that you are picking up on the fact that consciousness is the foundation to which a relationship can take place. Without the conscious awareness of myself and the distinction between myself and others, there are no conditions for a relationship. For in the unconscious, you have no individual identity. Rather, everyone is one identity and there is a complete absence of relationship. This is Jung's conceptualization of the unconscious based on his studies of primitive psychology and beliefs of ancient cultures around the world. So in the unconscious, you and me are the same person, and there is no distinction between us. We are essentially one. The distinction between us comes only through the eruption of consciousness, and now I can distinguish myself from you. So consciousness brings a separation between us, but that separation allows now for the forming of a relationship between us. Considering this fact, it is interesting to note that the masses are largely unconscious, and so most people only exhibit a limited amount of consciousness, and as a result, the psychological relationships that they can form are equally limited in capacity. So the majority of actions that people are taking are still ruled by unconscious motives and forces. At first, you might not agree with this, but we often largely overestimate the extent to which we are conscious. Our consciousness is a small blip on a vast ocean of unconsciousness, and yet our ego consciousness likes to think that all it knows is all there is, and so it perpetuates its own blindness and stalls further development and psychic growth. So therefore, Jung says, and I quote, "The greater the area of unconsciousness, the less is marriage a matter of free choice, as is shown subjectively in the fatal compulsion one feels so acutely when one is in love." Close quote. One such aspect that can influence free choice in a marriage is an unconscious tie to the parents. An example could be a mother keeping herself unconscious to an unsatisfying marriage and so unconsciously binds herself to her son as a kind of substitute for her husband. And such a relationship unconsciously influences the son's choice in a partner, and that choice doesn't reflect his original nature. His choices have been unconsciously modified by such a family dynamic. And there are many such scenarios like this. The underlying factor and source of problems in these cases seem to come from unconsciousness, a kind of blindness to the reality of things. But let us move on to the main unconscious influence over marriage, which is an unconscious outworking of biological instinct in order to maintain the species. Sure, an instinctive pairing is great for the continuation of the species, but in regards to forming a psychological relationship, this is not ideal, as there is a large gap between an instinctive personality and one that is individually differentiated. And Jung says, in this case, that individual happiness will be bound to suffer. It's actually quite easy to see if you have the psychological perceptiveness to observe such relationships. Most people seem to just end up with someone. They don't know how or why. They don't even really know who they're with. But they unconsciously found themselves with a partner. They might not even get along too well. The personalities are a complete mismatch, but they unconsciously were drawn to one another via the underlying biological instincts for the maintenance of the species. Of course, they wouldn't subjectively admit that, but it is easy to see from the outside that such a pairing was unconsciously derived, and they clearly have no idea what they have gotten themselves into. So just to flesh out this point a little more, here's a quote by Jung. Open quote. If the individual is to be regarded solely as an instrument for maintaining the species, then the purely instinctive choice of a matter is by far the best. But since the foundations of such a choice are unconscious, only a kind of impersonal liaison can be built upon them, such as can be observed to perfection among primitives. If we can speak here of a relationship at all, it is at best only a pale reflection of what we mean, a very distant state of affairs with a decidedly impersonal character, wholly regulated by traditional customs and prejudices, the prototype for every conventional marriage. Close quote. So basically, people are just getting married with whoever. It's ridiculous. They don't even get along or anything. You can just see it everywhere. But why does it keep happening? Because they are unconscious, or at least largely unconscious. And the unconscious forces, especially this biological instinct, are extremely powerful. And we can see how powerful it is when Jung says, open quote, unconsciousness results in non-differentiation or unconscious identity. The practical consequence of this is that one person presupposes in the other a psychological structure similar to his own. Normal sex life as a shared experience with apparently similar aims further strengthens the feeling of unity and identity. This state is described as one of complete harmony and is extolled as a great happiness, one heart and one soul, not without good reason, since the return to that original condition of unconscious oneness is like a return to childhood. Hence the childish gestures of all lovers. Even more, it is a return to the mother's womb, into the teeming depths of an as yet unconscious creativity. It is, in truth, a genuine and incontestable experience of the divine, whose transcendent force obliterates and consumes everything individual, a real communion with life and the impersonal power of fate. The individual will for self-possession is broken. The woman becomes the mother, the man the father, and thus both are robbed of their freedom and made instruments of the life urge. Close quote. Okay, so let us move on and talk about the problems that can arise from an anima or animus projection within a marriage. So in this diagram, you can see Jung's conception of an archetype that he called the marriage quaternio. It is from the perspective of one partner of a marriage, in this case a man. You can see the man, his wife, and his anima form a triangle, and so the marriage experiences this in their relationship. Then with further development, the square forms and the self also enters the psychological relationship. Jung says, open quote, these four constitute a half immanent and half transcendent quaternity, an archetype which I have called the marriage quaternio, close quote. I also created this other diagram with all 6 points in play, with both the husband corresponding with the wife, and their corresponding anima and animus forming the syzygy, and the self on either side represented as the old wise man and chthonic mother. I only created this so you can see all the players, so to speak, but actually the original quaternio that Jung was referring to with 4 quadrants is something quite special, as this symbology of 4 quadrants is found throughout ancient cultures as a kind of natural symbol. So it points to some kind of underlying archetypal structure of the primitive psyche, of which we still share in. So here's a quote by Jung, open quote. If such a projection fastens onto one of the marriage partners, a collective spiritual relationship conflicts with the collective biological one and produces in the container the division or disintegration I have described above. If he is able to hold his head above water, he will find himself through this very conflict. In that case, the projection, though dangerous in itself, will have helped him to pass from a collective to an individual relationship. This amounts to full conscious realization of the relationship that marriage brings." Close quote. Okay, so the first idea we can take away from the previous quote is that both the biological instinct that I was talking about earlier in the video and the projections of the anima and animus are of a collective nature. So there is kind of a blindness and danger on both sides. One is biological and one is spiritual or archetypal, according to Jung. So Jung says, open quote, "Since this goal is of a collective nature, the psychological link between husband and wife will also be essentially collective and cannot be regarded as an individual relationship in the psychological sense. We can only speak of this when the nature of the unconscious motivations has been recognized and the original identity broken down." Close quote. So each individual has to work past the unconscious biological urge as well as the unconscious projections of his or her anima or animus onto their partner. The anima and animus can only become realized by an individual through the relation to a partner of the opposite sex, for within such relationships is where the anima and animus projections begin to operate and take place. And as Jung stated in that earlier quote, that the individual has to hold their head above water, so to speak, so they have to continue to endure the conflict and tension that this projection provides within their marriage, in the hope that they can eventually see behind it and begin to integrate some of those aspects of the anima or animus archetype into their personality consciously, so that they can begin to see their partner for who they really are as an individual and not just as the collective projection of an archetype. So Jung says, open quote, "This disunity with oneself begets discontent, and since one is not conscious of the real state of things, one generally projects the reasons for it upon one's partner. A critical atmosphere thus develops, the necessary prelude to conscious realization. Usually this state does not begin simultaneously for both partners." Close quote. So this tension and discontentment is a part of the process of developing your personality, or what's known as spiritual development. Especially now that you have a collective conflict on both sides, one biological and one archetypal, there is an ever greater necessity to developing your consciousness and seeking to become the differentiated individual that you are, and as a result, forming a true psychological relationship. But this all depends on the individual's capacity for psychic development. And you'll note that I said earlier that not everyone develops at the same rate, and so this is what causes a lot of issues in marriage. Jung says, open quote, "These differences in tempo and in the degree of spiritual development are the chief causes of a typical difficulty which makes its appearance at critical moments." Close quote. And in another place, Jung says, open quote, "Psychic life is a development that can easily be arrested on the lowest levels. It is as though every individual has a specific gravity in accordance with which he either rises or sinks down to the level where he reaches his limit. His limits and convictions will be determined accordingly. No wonder then that by far the greater number of marriages reach their upper psychological limit in fulfillment of the biological aim, without injury to spiritual or moral health." Close quote. So Jung outlines the limitations of most people's development, and that the major difficulties in marriage arise from the differences in individual capacity between partners and their corresponding development and level of individuated consciousness. To illustrate this, Jung outlines what he called the contained and the container. While the container is characterized by complexity, the contained is of a much more simple nature. The contained is undivided and is completely contained within the relationship and has very little interest outside of it. But the downside is that they have a dependency on the container, whose personality can never be seen in its entirety, and so the contained doesn't feel as if they can always depend on the container. Because the container is kind of larger in their personality or more complex in their personality, they can't be fully consumed by the simple nature of the contained, and so the container is prone to splitting their personality off in favor of matching the simpler personality while losing or suppressing their complexity. The container, characterized by complexity, has a dissociated nature, and as a compensation will seek to unify his nature in an undivided love for another, but this intensity is usually unmatched by the simpler personality of the contained, who doesn't exhibit the capacity to entertain subtle and intricate complexities from the nature of the container, who seeks someone to complement and correspond with all the unique facets of his complex nature. The answer to such problems lies within themselves. The contained is to look within herself and recognize that the security she was seeking in the other person is to be found in herself. She then begins to find the complexity within herself that the container couldn't get out of her before. And the container is to stop trying to artificially integrate himself on the outside, allow himself to completely disintegrate, and at that point all the powers within himself that seek unity will resist the disintegration and form a conscious awareness of an inner integration, resulting in an undivided self, finding simplicity within himself. This example outlines the kind of transformations that take place within the marriage relationship. About this, Jung says, open quote, "It is a metamorphosis from a state in which man is only a tool of instinctive nature to another in which he is no longer a tool, but himself, a transformation of nature into culture, of instinct into spirit."